Iceland is one of the youngest inhabited countries on Earth, its entire human story beginning within a time frame short enough to be documented almost from the very start. No indigenous population, no prehistoric hunter-gatherers, no ancient farming settlements stretching back thousands of years, no layers of earlier human occupation for archaeologists to sort through or for later arrivals to displace, assimilate, or intermarry with, the kind of complicating factor that shapes population genetics almost everywhere else researchers have ever studied. Human history on this remote North Atlantic island effectively begins around 1100 years ago, when the first Norse settlers arrived aboard longships and began building a new society from scratch on a volcanic landscape unlike anything they had ever seen before, a place with no prior human footprint at all, a genuinely rare situation in the story of human settlement anywhere on Earth, one that gives researchers a genuinely clean, uncomplicated starting point, free of the kind of pre-existing indigenous population that complicates ancestry studies almost everywhere else on the planet, and one that makes every subsequent genetic finding about this population considerably easier to interpret with confidence. For over 1,000 years, Icelanders have told a fairly consistent story about who those first settlers actually were. A story preserved not just in oral tradition, but in one of the most remarkable written historical records anywhere in the medieval world, a body of literature that scholars have studied intensively and carefully for well over a century now, long before anyone imagined genetic science would one day be able to test its underlying claims directly, treating it purely as literature and legal history rather than as a potential source of testable, verifiable genetic hypotheses. And now, ancient DNA evidence is finally allowing scientists to test that story directly against the genomes of the settlers themselves, revealing a founding population considerably more complicated and more surprising than the simple Viking narrative most people have heard. It's a story that touches on exploration and ambition, but also on raiding, captivity, and the messy, often uncomfortable realities of how populations actually form during one of history's most romanticized periods of expansion. If you know anything about Iceland's history, you probably know the basic outline. Norse settlers, Vikings in the popular imagination, sailed west from Scandinavia starting around the year 870, establishing farms and settlements across the island's habitable coastal regions over the following decades. This period, known as the Age of Settlement, is documented in extraordinary detail in medieval texts like the Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, a genealogical and historical record compiling the names, origins, and family histories of hundreds of the island's earliest settlers, along with the Icelandic family sagas, sprawling and richly detailed narrative accounts that blend history, family drama, and legend into some of the richest literary output of the medieval world. Works like Njál's saga and Egil's saga, still read and studied today, describe specific families, specific farms, and specific feuds with a level of narrative detail that has no real parallel anywhere else in medieval Europe, offering historians and now geneticists an unusually rich and detailed body of source material to work from when trying to accurately reconstruct exactly who these earliest settlers actually were and where their lives, loyalties, and eventual descendants led over the centuries that followed. What makes Iceland such an extraordinary case study for genetics is this unusual combination of factors: a population with a clearly defined starting point, a wealth of detailed historical and genealogical documentation stretching back over 1,000 years, and crucially, a modern population that has maintained meticulous genealogical records ever since, allowing researchers to trace family lines with a level of precision found almost nowhere else in the world today. In many cases, connecting a living Icelander today back through an unbroken documented chain of ancestors stretching all the way to the original settlement period itself, an achievement made possible by centuries of careful record-keeping, combined with a national culture that has long placed real value and importance on knowing precisely where one's family comes from. Add to that a well-preserved tradition of ancient burial practices that has yielded exceptional ancient DNA samples from the earliest settlement period, and you have what many population geneticists consider one of the single best natural laboratories anywhere on the planet for studying how a founding population's genetic makeup evolves over time across centuries. Very few places in the world offer this exact combination of a clean genetic starting point, extensive written documentation stretching back to that starting point, and a modern population willing and able to participate extensively in genetic research, which is part of why Iceland has become such a frequently cited case study across multiple different fields of genetic research, well beyond questions of ancestry alone. The traditional story, as told in the sagas and in most popular accounts of Icelandic history, describes the settlers as overwhelmingly Norwegian, elite families, and their followers leaving Norway during a period of political consolidation under King Harald Fairhair, seeking new land and even greater independence far across the sea. King Harald's push to unify Norway's fractious regional chieftaincies under a single centralized crown reportedly displaced or alienated a significant number of independent-minded landowning families, many of whom, according to the sagas, chose emigration over submission, setting the stage for the wave of settlement that would follow over the subsequent decades. This narrative fits neatly into the broader story of Viking Age expansion across the North Atlantic. And for a long time, it was largely taken at face value, both in popular culture and in a good deal of earlier academic scholarship. Museums, tourist materials, and even school curricula in Iceland, for much of the 20th century, tended to present the settlement story in fairly straightforward terms. Brave Norwegian farmers and chieftains, unwilling to submit to increasing royal centralization back home, striking out across dangerous open ocean to build a new, freer society on unclaimed land. It's a genuinely compelling narrative, and it isn't entirely wrong, but as researchers would eventually discover, it was also very far from the complete picture. But there was always a curious wrinkle in this straightforward Norwegian settlement story, one that Icelandic sagas themselves hint at repeatedly without fully explaining. The texts mention it almost in passing at times, a brief note about a settler's household, including individuals of Irish or Hebridean origin, woven into the broader narrative without any special emphasis, as though it were simply an unremarkable, everyday fact of life during the settlement period, rather than something requiring further explanation or comment. Alongside the Norwegian settlers, the sagas describe substantial numbers of people arriving from the British Isles, specifically from Norse settlements that had already been established in Ireland, Scotland, and the Scottish Islands during the preceding decades of Viking expansion into that region. Some of these individuals are described as Norse settlers who had already been living in the British Isles for a generation or more before continuing on to Iceland. But the sagas also describe something else. Substantial numbers of people of Gaelic origin, Irish and Scottish men and women, arriving alongside the Norse settlers, some apparently as free settlers in their own right, and others, more troublingly, described in terms suggesting they had been brought as captives or slaves during Norse raiding expeditions across Ireland and Scotland before the journey to Iceland ever began. The sagas are not shy or evasive about this detail, describing it in relatively matter-of-fact terms, consistent with the broader realities of the Viking Age economy, in which raiding, trading, and settlement were often deeply intertwined activities carried out by the same groups of people, sometimes even within a single voyage or expedition. This raised an obvious and important question for researchers studying Iceland's genetic history. If the sagas are accurate in describing the substantial Gaelic contribution to the founding population, that should be detectable in the genetic makeup of Iceland's earliest settlers, and by extension, in the genetic makeup of the modern Icelandic population that descended from them. This is precisely the kind of question that sits at the productive intersection of history and genetics, where a claim documented in written sources can be tested, refined, or challenged using an entirely independent body of physical evidence, rather than researchers being forced to rely solely on how convincing or internally consistent a given historical text happens to read. For decades, geneticists studying modern Icelandic DNA had already found intriguing hints of exactly this pattern, comparing mitochondrial DNA passed down through the maternal line against Y-chromosome data passed down through the paternal line, a comparative approach that turned out to be enormously revealing precisely because it allowed researchers to examine the paternal and maternal sides of the founding population's ancestry as two genuinely separate historical threads, rather than blending them together into a single, less informative average. What those earlier studies found was genuinely striking, and it pointed toward a founding population with a very specific and unusual internal structure, one that would take researchers years of careful, methodical, comparative analysis to fully characterize and confirm with genuine scientific confidence. When researchers examined Y-chromosome data tracing paternal ancestry, the Icelandic population showed overwhelming similarity to Norwegian and broader Scandinavian populations, consistent with the traditional saga narrative of Norse men as the dominant founding fathers of the settlement. But when researchers turned to mitochondrial DNA tracing maternal ancestry, the picture looked dramatically different. A substantial proportion, in some studies estimated at well over half, of Icelandic maternal lineages traced back not to Scandinavia, but to the British Isles, specifically showing strong genetic affinities with populations from Ireland and Scotland. This split between paternal and maternal ancestry was not a subtle statistical nuance buried deep in the data. It was a clear, striking pattern that immediately stood out to researchers, precisely the kind of finding that demands a historical explanation rather than being dismissed outright as mere noise or coincidence, and it lined up remarkably closely with exactly what the sagas themselves had been describing for nearly 1,000 years, waiting for genetic science to finally catch up with it and confirm it properly. This is a remarkable and, in some ways, uncomfortable finding once you sit with what it actually implies. It suggests a founding population built substantially around Norse men and Gaelic women, a pattern entirely consistent with the saga accounts describing raiding expeditions across Ireland and Scotland that brought captive women to Iceland alongside free Norse settlers, forming families and communities in which the paternal lineage was overwhelmingly Scandinavian, while the maternal lineage was, to a very significant degree, Gaelic in origin, a demographic pattern that, once you understand the historical context behind it, actually makes a great deal of grim sense, reflecting how Viking raiding parties operating across Ireland and Scotland during this period frequently and deliberately took captives specifically for labor and, in many documented cases, forced marriage or concubinage back at the raiders' home settlements. It's a finding that adds real, sobering historical texture to what popular culture often romanticizes as a simple story of Viking exploration and settlement, revealing instead a founding population shaped in substantial part by the violence and displacement of the broader Viking Age raiding economy across the British Isles. It's worth remembering that this period of Norse expansion into Ireland and Scotland was, from the perspective of the local Gaelic populations experiencing it, a genuinely traumatic era of coastal raids, monastery attacks, and forced captivity, and Iceland's founding population carries a direct genetic echo of that history within it, a sobering counterpoint to the more celebratory framing that has often dominated popular retellings of the Viking Age. For years, this remained the standard picture based primarily on modern DNA, comparing the genetic signatures of present-day Icelanders against reference populations from Scandinavia and the British Isles. But modern DNA can only tell you so much, because 1,000 years of subsequent population history, genetic drift, and selective pressures can all reshape a population's genetic profile in ways that complicate any attempt to reconstruct the exact makeup of the original founding population. This is where ancient DNA, extracted directly from skeletal remains dating to the earliest settlement period, became so valuable, offering researchers a genuine snapshot of the founding population itself, rather than an inference reconstructed backward from 1,000 years later. Ancient DNA, in this sense, functions almost like a time machine for population genetics, allowing researchers to bypass the accumulated noise and drift of 10 centuries of subsequent history and examine the founding generation's genetic makeup, with a level of directness that no amount of clever statistical modeling using only modern samples could ever fully replicate. Beginning in the past decade or so, researchers gained access to an increasing number of ancient DNA samples recovered from some of Iceland's earliest pagan-era burial sites, graves dating to the initial settlement period before Iceland's conversion to Christianity around the year 1000, an event that itself marks a significant turning point in Icelandic burial practices, after which cremation and grave good burial customs, common in the pagan period, gradually gave way to Christian burial traditions, making pre-conversion burial sites especially valuable for this specific line of genetic research. These burials, often accompanied by grave goods consistent with Norse pagan burial customs, offered a direct genetic window into the generation of settlers who actually made the first journey across the North Atlantic, rather than their descendants centuries removed from the original migration. Recovering usable ancient DNA from human remains, this old is itself a genuinely difficult technical achievement, requiring careful excavation, contamination-free laboratory handling, and increasingly sophisticated sequencing techniques, capable of extracting readable genetic information from bone and tooth samples that have spent over 1,000 years buried in Iceland's cold, often waterlogged volcanic soil, conditions that can be either remarkably preservative or genuinely destructive to ancient DNA depending on the specific burial context involved, a variability that makes each successfully sequenced ancient sample from this period a genuinely valuable and hard-won piece of evidence. What the ancient DNA revealed largely confirmed and refined the earlier picture drawn from modern populations, while adding considerably more nuance and precision. The earliest settlers showed a genetic profile combining Norse Scandinavian ancestry with a substantial Gaelic component, broadly consistent with what modern DNA studies had already suggested, though the ancient samples allowed researchers to examine this mixture with far greater precision, distinguishing between different possible source populations within both the Scandinavian and Gaelic components in ways that comparisons using only modern populations simply couldn't achieve, since 1,000 years of subsequent mixing and drift tends to blur exactly these kinds of fine-grained regional distinctions when working with present-day DNA alone. One particularly interesting refinement to emerge from the ancient DNA involved the geographic origin of the settlers within Scandinavia itself. While the traditional saga narrative emphasizes Norway specifically as the settlers' point of origin, genetic analysis of the ancient samples revealed a somewhat more complex picture, with evidence suggesting genetic contributions not just from Norway, but from a broader swath of Scandinavia and Norse settlements across the North Atlantic and British Isles, consistent with a settlement process that drew on Norse populations that had already been dispersing and establishing new communities across a wide geographic area during the preceding decades of Viking Age expansion, rather than a single, clean migration wave departing directly from a single homeland, a nuance that the somewhat simplified traditional narrative, understandably shaped by centuries of retelling, had largely smoothed over. This more distributed pattern of Scandinavian origin makes considerable historical sense once you consider the broader context of Norse expansion during this period. By the time large-scale settlement of Iceland began, Norse communities had already been establishing footholds across a wide arc of the North Atlantic for decades, including in the Faroe Islands, Shetland, Orkney, and parts of Ireland and Scotland, creating a genuinely interconnected network of Norse settlements from which Iceland's earliest colonists could plausibly have been drawn, rather than a single, direct departure point back in mainland Norway. Perhaps the most scientifically significant contribution of this ancient DNA research, though, involves what happened to the Icelandic population after that initial settlement period. A question that ancient DNA is uniquely positioned to answer because it allows researchers to track genetic change across successive generations by comparing samples from different time periods within Iceland's own history. This kind of longitudinal genetic tracking, examining the same population at multiple distinct points across 1,000 years of continuous history, is exceptionally rare in population genetics research generally, since it requires exactly the kind of well-preserved skeletal record and continuous, unbroken population history that very few places in the world can offer, in combination the way Iceland can. What researchers found here genuinely surprised many people working in the field. Comparing the genetic profile of the earliest Norse Gaelic settler population against the genetic profile of the modern Icelandic population revealed a measurable and significant shift over the intervening 1,000 years, one that went in a specific and at first glance somewhat counterintuitive direction. The modern Icelandic population shows a noticeably higher proportion of Scandinavian ancestry and a correspondingly lower proportion of Gaelic ancestry, compared to the founding settler population documented in the ancient DNA samples. In other words, the genetic balance between the Norse and Gaelic components of Iceland's ancestry actually shifted over the past 1,000 years, moving further towards Scandinavian ancestry, rather than remaining stable or drifting further in the opposite direction. Many researchers, going into this comparison, might reasonably have expected the opposite outcome, or perhaps expected the ratio to simply hold steady across the centuries in a genuinely isolated population with limited subsequent immigration. Finding instead a clear, measurable shift specifically favoring Scandinavian ancestry over Gaelic ancestry was the kind of result that demanded a real explanation rather than being waved away as an artifact of sampling or methodology. This finding required careful investigation to explain, because population geneticists generally don't expect ancestry proportions within an isolated founding population to shift dramatically over time without some specific mechanism driving that change. Iceland, being a remote island with very limited immigration for most of its history after the initial settlement period, represented an unusually clean, closed genetic system, without the kind of ongoing immigration from multiple different source populations that typically explains gradual ancestry shifts in other parts of the world. Most population genetics research examining shifting ancestry proportions over time is working with populations that experienced continuous, overlapping waves of immigration from various source populations across the relevant time period, making it comparatively straightforward to attribute ancestry shifts to specific, identifiable migration events. Iceland's genuine isolation after the settlement period removes that explanation almost entirely, forcing researchers to look instead at internal population dynamics operating within the existing founder population itself. Researchers investigating this question have proposed several possible explanations, and the current scientific consensus points toward a combination of factors rather than any single, simple cause. One significant contributor appears to be genetic drift operating within a relatively small founding population over many generations, a statistical phenomenon in which random chance in which individuals happen to have more descendants than others, particularly pronounced in smaller and more genetically bottlenecked populations, can gradually shift the overall genetic makeup of a population even without any new migration or selective pressure being involved at all, simply through the ordinary, unremarkable randomness of who happens to survive, marry, and successfully raise children across each successive generation. Given that Iceland's early population was, by modern standards, genuinely quite small for many centuries, this kind of genetic drift plausibly could have played a meaningful role in gradually reshaping the ancestry balance over dozens of generations. Some researchers have also proposed that differential fertility or survival between individuals with different ancestral backgrounds during Iceland's difficult early centuries, marked by volcanic eruptions, famines, and harsh subsistence farming conditions, could have contributed to this ancestry shift, though this remains a more difficult hypothesis to test directly using the available genetic evidence alone, and researchers are generally cautious about overstating this particular explanation without more direct supporting evidence from the historical and archaeological record. Iceland's early centuries were, by any measure, extraordinarily difficult, marked by repeated volcanic eruptions that devastated farmland and livestock, periodic famines that swept through vulnerable communities, and a subsistence farming system operating at the very edge of what the harsh subarctic climate could reliably support. It's entirely plausible that these repeated environmental crises could have affected different family lines and communities unevenly, though disentangling any specific ancestry-linked pattern from the broader, more general hardship experienced across the entire population remains a genuinely difficult analytical challenge that researchers continue to work through carefully. And what makes this entire body of research so valuable extends well beyond satisfying curiosity about Iceland's specific history, though that history is certainly compelling in its own right. Iceland functions as an unusually clear natural laboratory for studying broader questions in population genetics, precisely because of its well-documented founding population, its historical isolation, and its exceptional record-keeping tradition, both genealogical and, more recently, genetic. Findings from Icelandic population genetics research have informed broader scientific understanding of how genetic drift operates in real historical populations, how founding population effects shape long-term genetic diversity, and how ancestry proportions within an isolated population can shift measurably over timescales as short as a single millennium, insights that extend well beyond Iceland itself to inform how researchers interpret genetic data from other historically isolated populations around the world. Islands, mountain valleys, remote peninsulas, and other geographically bounded regions all over the globe share at least some structural similarities with Iceland's situation, even if few can match its documentary richness, and lessons learned from studying how genetic drift and founder effects played out over Iceland's 1,000 years of recorded history provide a valuable comparative framework that researchers can apply, with appropriate caution, to interpreting genetic patterns found in far less well-documented isolated populations elsewhere. There's also a broader cultural dimension to this research that's worth considering, one that touches directly on modern Icelandic identity. For much of the 20th century, Icelandic national identity emphasized the Norse Viking heritage of the settlement period quite heavily, celebrating the sagas and the Norwegian settler tradition as central to the national story. The genetic evidence revealing such a substantial Gaelic component, and particularly the specific historical circumstances suggested by the pattern of Norse paternal and Gaelic maternal ancestry, has prompted a meaningful reconsideration of this national narrative within Iceland itself over the past few decades, encouraging a more complete and historically honest accounting of the settlement period, one that acknowledges both the achievement of the Norse settlement itself and the more difficult history of raiding, captivity, and displacement that appears to have shaped the founding population alongside it. Modern Icelandic historians and educators have increasingly incorporated this more complete picture into how the settlement period is taught and discussed, moving away from a purely celebratory framing toward one that treats the founding population's mixed and sometimes difficult origins as an integral rather than an inconvenient part of the national story. This more complete picture doesn't diminish the genuine historical achievement represented by Iceland's settlement and the remarkable medieval literary tradition it produced. If anything, it adds depth and human complexity to a story that had, for a long time, been told in a more simplified and celebratory form. The Icelandic sagas themselves, when read carefully, actually anticipated much of what modern genetics would eventually confirm, describing exactly this pattern of Norse settlers, Gaelic wives and captives, and a founding population considerably more diverse and more historically complicated than the popular Viking narrative usually acknowledges, a detail that had simply been overlooked or underemphasized in how that literary tradition was popularly understood and taught for much of the past century. Modern Icelandic genetic research has continued to expand well beyond the settlement period questions, building on the country's extensive genealogical records and its participation in some of the largest population-scale genetic studies conducted anywhere in the world. Iceland's unique combination of a well-documented founding population, historical isolation, and comprehensive modern genealogical and medical record-keeping has made it an important resource for broader medical and population genetics research, extending well beyond questions of ancestry alone, contributing significantly to scientific understanding of genetic disease risk, population health patterns, and the broader mechanics of human genetic variation more generally. Iceland's national genetic database, built through extensive voluntary participation from the population, combined with the country's exceptional genealogical record-keeping tradition, has become an internationally significant and widely cited resource, cited in medical genetics research well beyond Iceland's own borders, illustrating how a small nation's unusual historical circumstances can end up contributing disproportionately to global scientific knowledge in fields that, at first glance, might seem to have little to do with questions of ancient ancestry at all. Looking specifically at the settlement period question that started this entire line of research, though, the picture that has emerged after decades of genetic investigation is considerably richer and more historically grounded than the simplified popular narrative. most people are familiar with. Iceland's founding population was not a single, homogeneous group of Norwegian settlers sailing confidently toward an empty island, but instead represented a genuinely mixed population, shaped by the complex realities of Viking Age expansion across the North Atlantic and British Isles, including both voluntary migration and, for a significant portion of the founding population, the harsher historical realities of captivity and forced displacement, all combining over the following 1,000 years into the distinctive and, until recently, only partially understood genetic profile of the modern Icelandic nation. It's a genuinely rare thing in the study of human history to be able to trace a population's genetic story with this much precision, from a documented starting point through 1,000 years of subsequent change, right up to the present day. And Iceland's unique combination of circumstances has made that kind of detailed reconstruction possible in a way that very few other places on Earth could match. A genuine testament to what happens when rigorous science, careful historical scholarship, and a remarkably well-preserved documentary tradition all come together around a single, well-bounded population. And this raises an intriguing question researchers are now turning their attention to across other historically documented island settlements around the world. If a founding population as well documented and thoroughly studied as Iceland's could contain this much previously unrecognized complexity, hidden beneath a well-known and widely accepted historical narrative for so many centuries, what similar stories might be waiting to be uncovered in other island populations with comparably rich documentary and genealogical traditions, places where researchers have only just begun applying the same combination of ancient DNA analysis and careful historical investigation that finally revealed the full, complicated truth behind Iceland's founding settlers. Researchers have already begun turning their attention to other North Atlantic island communities with comparably rich documentary traditions, including the Faroe Islands and parts of Orkney and Shetland, applying similar and equally careful combinations of ancient DNA analysis and careful historical cross-referencing to see whether comparable patterns of hidden complexity and comparable shifts in ancestry proportions over time might be waiting to be discovered in these closely related but historically distinct settlement stories as well, each shaped by its own specific mixture of Norse expansion, local populations, and the passage of 1,000 years of subsequent history.